Hello, welcome to the second content lecture for Soccer 3666. And today I'll be focusing on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, discussing the notion of lifestyle, and then bringing in the idea of reflexivity to think about how recent social change has in some ways challenged some of Bourdieu's ideas, made them a little bit more complex, and in other ways maybe reinforced them somewhat. So I'll be breaking up the lecture into three parts. I'll be just doing a little introductory thing to review back to what the course has been about so far, and thinking about some of the notions of self-identity and social identity. Then in the second part, I'll be going through some of Bourdieu's ideas specifically to help us think about how they're useful for thinking about consumption. And in the third part, I'll kind of extend that a little bit more and then bring in the ideas of reflexivity and lifestyles in particular to challenge some of those assumptions. What this week is, I think, particularly good at thinking about in terms of sociology is the very idea of choice. And I suppose Bourdieu's work in particular fundamentally challenges the idea that we have free choice, but it's not deterministic like Marx. Bourdieu acknowledges that we have relative autonomy to make choices in our everyday lives, but we're socialised into the world in a particular place, at a particular time, surrounded by people that are often quite like us, and this will have an effect on what our choices are and how we express ourselves. So in terms of consumption here, Bourdieu's work can kind of help us think about how taste in particular is really important to our identity. I'm thinking here about like the notions of, I consume, therefore I am. How does these ways that I consume engage with, the authentic notion that I have of myself, but also how am I manipulated through aspirations and through desires and through consumer culture. So today's work and today's content thinks about how there's this kind of connection between our choice, our taste, and the ways we try and distinguish ourselves from each other, both as individuals, but also within groups. This kind of upbringing, the kind of way that we're socialised into the world, leads us to a particular lifestyle, profoundly affects our perceptions of being normal and being comfortable, and, affects our perceptions of others. So there's some underlying basics here to consider, and the reading, I think, does a good job of highlighting these. Veblen's work about conspicuous consumption and social emulation here is kind of foundational to what we're going to look at today. Veblen argues that the way of being in the world is to kind of emulate others who we want to be like, and we'll pursue that. It's kind of one of the motivations to consume in a particular way. Simel's work on in the rise of urban metropolises and how that was really important to consumer culture developing, and that development of what he called the blasé attitude, how we kind of float through urban areas and we don't really relate specifically to other people. We kind of ignore them mostly unless things are out of the ordinary. The reason Simel argues we develop that is that, being in the middle of global cities is really overwhelming to the senses. And so we have to develop this kind of almost defense mechanism not to be overwhelmed. And we then try and kind of, blend in with those who are like us and those that are around us. Mary Douglas highlights how consumer culture itself is a form of competition, particularly around status and identity. And Ingold talks about how what he calls our perpetual ecology is constituted between that interplay of wants and needs, where we value the symbolic value over the use value. And that kind of, again, harks back to the work of the Frankfurt School a little bit there. I think a really good study to think about this kind of need to be an individual and need to conform that these theories touch upon is Stephen Miles and colleagues' work about fitting in and sticking out, where they did this really interesting research with school kids in the UK in terms of the way that they, particularly the way they dress. And they kind of expressed it through this, what they called notions of fitting in and sticking out, that we're kind of motivated by those twin desires that both relate to each other, but sometimes compete with each other as well. So this touches on some of the foundational ideas of identity here, and that's that distinction between self-identity and social identity. Self-identity is the conception that we hold of ourselves, while social identity is the expectations and the opinions of others. So there's a constant kind of play-off here. You can relate this to those kind of notions of agency and structure. And Bourdieu's work, I suppose, critically engages with this dichotomy. It tries to move past these dichotomies to point out how the way that we are in the world is kind of heavily influenced by the way that we've been brought into the world, and that kind of subjective-objective divide in the notion of habitus is a key way of thinking about how we are comfortable, what our tastes are, who we identify with, and what our morals and values are. Okay, so I'll leave this section at that, and in the next section I'll move on and outline the work of Pierre Bourdieu.